Welcome back to another episode of Dolphins In Depth. Dolphin fans, we've got the NFL Draft on deck Thursday night. Going to take you Friday, second round and third round. And then day 3 of the draft is going to be on Saturday, I believe beginning at noon. Right now, for one of our final draft installments, getting you prepared and ready for the 2025 NFL Draft, we've got Simon Clancy on. I have got a fresh draft book report from Simon. Obviously, Simon, I'm going through it right now, and I want you to tell the people where they can actually find your draft report and order one for themselves.
Yeah, you can send me an email at 2025, that's 2025, draft book, all one word, 2025 draft book at gmail.com.
And how much are you selling your life's work for? Life's work of 2025.
If you live in the United Kingdom, it's £10. If you live in the United States, it's $13. It's actually gone up $1, but solely because of what's happening with your financial markets, which means that if I sold it for the $12 of last year, it would have been significantly less money in UK pounds than it was this year. So that's the only reason why. So $13.
And no tariff charge.
No UK tariff for us, no tariff. There's no tariff on this deal for us. You get it tariff-free draft book.
All right. Simon, first, I want to do a little bit of Dolphins talk with you because obviously you paid attention to the Greer press conference. What did you make of that? And also, what do you think is the possibility that they can get anything decent? And what would you define as decent for Jaylen Ramsey?
What did I make of it? I mean, it sort of seemed to follow on from his end of season excuses tour press conference, the Chris Greer equivalent of the Taylor Swift Eras tour, where he just seemed to make lots of excuses. I thought it was fascinating, some of the things that he said, where he talked about, for example, he deferred too much to coaches and other people around him, always just to say, well, it wasn't really my fault that it's been so rubbish. It's, I was just taking other people's advice. I
don't think that's fair because that's probably taking ownership for your greatest criticism. I don't know if he was blame shifting because he's always said, these are my draft picks. However, part of the criticism is he's way too accommodating, but that's exactly how he got into that position. So
yeah, but I think at some point, Omar, you've got to be like, you've got to own it. And I've always felt uncomfortable with the fact that he hasn't quite owned it. And it goes back to the conversation that fans have and we've had. The famous you value offensive linemen more than we do, that sort of stuff, kind of laughing in the face of people. I don't know. It just, and then it seemed to be, he wanted it to be a success because he doesn't want people to, like, you guys to be on the back of me. And it just felt like a little bit kind of, come on, we've not made the playoffs we've not won a playoff game since, I mean, my kids weren't even born. I'm sitting in my daughter's university house. She's going to be 21 in a few months' time. We've not won a playoff game since before she was born, and it's crazy. And you look at how the roster is shaping up and what's happening, and it feels like that isn't going to change this year either. So, and as for the Jalen Ramsey thing, in terms of look, it's disappointing. I think that it's come to this, but if you think about value, yes, he is still a good player, and certainly in the first half of last year, I thought he was outstanding. I thought he tailed off a little bit in the second half. It was still at a high level, but if you think that what the Dolphins got for him or got him for a couple of years ago. So he was 28.
Yeah.
And they got him for a third round pick and a third string tight end that might not have made the roster in Hunter Long. 2 years on, it's essentially a 1 year rental based on the fact there's no guaranteed money after this season. I mean, realistically, and we know what happens to cornerbacks when they hit 30, 31, 32, because it just happens the whole time. And you've seen it certainly with the Eagles. You look at something like James Bradshaw, for example, who 2 years ago was pretty good, fell off a cliff last year. I suspect the same thing will happen with Darius Slay as he starts to slow down. It's just the nature of the beast in terms of the pressure on hips and ankles and knees and all those things where you have to just change direction so rapidly and the body can only last so long. I mean, I think if the Dolphins get a fourth rounder, I think they'll be doing well. I probably think it'll end up being a fifth rounder. And that's just the way the league is, unfortunately. You're giving away a future gold jacket wearer potentially, and you're not getting a great deal in return. And unfortunately, that's just the nature of the beast when you consider, what the opportunity cost is for the buying team.
Mm-hmm. Now, let me ask you this question, because before we get into your draft book, because I do have some questions and some comments and some concerns. Where would you say the depth is at this cornerback position? Because now we walked the last 2 times we talked, we had a clear understanding that we needed one cornerback, one starting caliber cornerback, because anybody putting stock in Storm Duck or Cam Smith becoming glorified starters, you're probably a little bit delusional. Maybe Ethan Bonner. No, not Ethan Bonner, the nickel.
Kader Kohou?
Yeah, maybe Kader Kohou goes on the boundary and you find yourself a new nickel. Okay, cool. But now we need 2 starting cornerbacks. Where would you say the depth is in this draft? At that position?
Yeah, I mean, I think the depth-wise is there are lots of very good corners that are, both nickels and outside corners. And I think what's quite interesting, and we'll get, obviously, I know we're going to get some guys, but you look, for example, the crazy thing is that last time I was on, 3-4 weeks ago, we talked about it. It was like, well, I mean, the first overall pick for the Dolphins at 13 has to be a defensive tackle. I mean, it can't be anything else. And now we're in a situation where it's like, it has to be a cornerback. It can't be anything else.
I disagree with all those thought processes. I actually think it has to be the best player on the board.
Yeah,
I'm very convicted to this from this standpoint, because you have Ashton Jeanty as the number 3 pick in this draft. Yeah. Let's just say, for poops and giggles, Jeanty slides. Okay, let's say he slides to 13. Are you realistically going to pass him up, even though you have a Devon Achane and you have him rated 3rd on your board?
Yeah, I mean, I just don't believe that he'll get. I just look at Vegas at 6, Chicago at 10. I just can't see him getting past Ben Johnson at 10. When you look at what Ben Johnson likes to do with his running backs, and maybe Johnson thinks he can get a Travion Henderson in the 2nd round and do what he did with Jahmyr Gibbs, but I just think that Jeanty just fits what they want to do so much on offense. So I realistically, Omar, can't see Jeanty falling to 13. If he was there, then obviously, and I'm sure they've played these scenarios through in their draft room, but he would be impossible to pass up. He'd be very difficult to pass up because, as you just said, I have him as the 3rd best player, and it's that there are 3 elite players in this draft, and he's one of them. And that's very difficult to pass up. And I don't believe, as we've discussed before, that I don't believe that running, Devon Achane at 180 pounds dripping wet through the A gap is the answer to any of the Miami's questions. So,
somebody other than me has to say this.
I mean, but it's true though. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. You can't, especially when teams were crowding the box, and you just can't do that. They're playing cloud coverage over the top, and then trying to get you to beat them in the run game, and you can't do it because you're running a 175 pound scat back through the A gap behind an offensive line that isn't very good at the guard position. So the fact that, I mean, I think he had more tackles behind the line of scrimmage and more lost yards than any feature running back in the league last season. That's not a shock to me. So
I don't think he's a featured back, but
he's not a feature back, and that's the point. He's not a feature back. He was perfectly used year one. Perfectly used year one in terms of being a change of pace, delivering big plays. Defense is tiring 2nd half, 4th quarter, some pass routes, some screens, bubbles, all of those things. Amazing, perfect usage. Last year, running him like Eric Dickerson back in the 1980s is not the way forwards.
Yeah. Okay. Let's get into some of your draft guides here, because I love it. I'm not going to give away all your spoilers. You have Will Johnson rated very highly. I actually do as well. I think I'm hearing he's falling, he's sliding. I'm hearing he's a possibility at 13 from this standpoint. Nobody has a time on him. There's concern about his speed. He's a zone guy, which I think makes him a perfect fit for Anthony Weaver, but it doesn't necessarily make him a good fit for every scheme. If he's there at 13, do you take him no matter who's left on the board?
I think you'd have to have a conversation. I think there's 2 corners, and really, I think it's going to come down to stylistically what they want to do, which is whether or not they want to take Barron, the Thorpe Award winner, or they want to take Johnson, because stylistically they're quite different. I think Barron can do a lot more. I don't think he's necessarily the pure outside corner that Johnson is, but I think that what he's able to do. Look, what I think is really interesting with the Dolphins is that, and the reason why I love the prospect of Barron is that like Kader Kohou, he can play inside, he can play out. Barron can also play safety. He can also play robber. And Kader was the guy they often inverted to play the deep half, and they'd kind of buzz the safeties down and play 2 deep coverage. So you've got a corner here that can play outside, can play inside, can move to safety, can play the nickel.
Didn't we say the same thing about Javon Holland? And how often did you see him play the nickel?
Yeah, I mean, very rarely, and that's the weird thing because he literally played. I think I counted the year that he came.
I have heard this whole versatility. He could play multiple positions, and going back to the Minka Fitzpatrick. And remember, Minka left bolted because you wouldn't let him play deep safety.
Yeah, but what I will say about this is that you look at what Anthony Weaver did with Baltimore and the pieces that he had with Kyle Hamilton, who was obviously drafted as a pure single high free safety who can get sideline to sideline and use that amazing speed. That is not what Kyle Hamilton does at all. He is this incredible chess piece on the back end. You can't replicate that because, everybody says, oh, you need to get your next Kyle Hamilton. He's an alien. He's one of those just absolutely unique players. But what I find really interesting is that you look at some of those other players on that Baltimore defense in that secondary. And I take specifically Marlon Humphrey, who is an outstanding corner, was an outstanding boundary corner at Alabama, came to the league, was an outstanding boundary corner at Baltimore. But what Weaver did in his final year and what he did last year was turn him into an all things for all people. He played in the nickel. He was an amazing blitzer off the edge. He had like
Hamilton or
Humphrey? I'm talking about Marlon Humphrey. So Humphrey went from being this pure outside corner to a guy that just played all over the field, did all these different things. And I think that's what Weaver loves to do. And you go back and you look at what Kohou can do. You look at what Barron can do. And the idea that just this sort of defensive rotation, almost on a snap-by-snap basis. And you pair that with a Melifonwu, for example, who was a cornerback in college anyway, and how they can really sort of play some games with the structure of the back end with somebody like Barron. I think it's really interesting. I think to me, that's what Weaver will. Because I thought about it when the news happened about Ramsey last week or earlier this week or whenever it was. I was thinking, well, it's going to have to be Johnson now because they need to replace pure corner with pure corner. But actually, the more I've thought about it, the more I think, well, actually, maybe what Weaver wants actually is this guy that can do some things that Hamilton, not the same as Hamilton, but can do some things that Hamilton can do, but can do what Brian Branch.
Are you putting Barron in the Hamilton category?
No, not at all. But I put him in the category of somebody that can do multiple things. I'm putting him in the Brian Branch category, absolutely. That he's a very similar player to Branch. But I think Johnson is very much just an outside corner. Whereas Barron is, all things to all people.
I don't know if that's fair because I don't think we've had the opportunity to see Will Johnson play nickel because he didn't have to. No, and just because you haven't seen a guy play nickel doesn't necessarily mean that he can't. Because I don't think there's a lack of physicality with Johnson, and there's certainly a tremendous amount of instinct. He plays that T-step, which I'm actually a big fan of. Where if you're going to be a zone cornerback, that T-step is important in terms of you be able to identify what's going on and still trail your man, but still have the instincts to cut on the ball. Yeah. Yes, I have concern. The only concern I have with Will Johnson is the turf toe because I had a college friend who played for FSU. He's a starter cornerback for FSU, and he had turf toe. And I watched how he was like a 3-year starter. And it just led to a significant decline because he was never able to get off the foot. Yeah. And in my mind, I think the only way that you can improve turf toe or fix turf toe is you've 6 months in a boot.
Rest, yeah. And I think that's why he sat out the rest of the season. I think that's why he just wiped it out. The one thing I would say about Johnson playing in the nickel, and your point is absolutely apposite, but I do think I think you have to go back to that pro day timing the other day and look at that 433 short shuttle, which was extremely average. I mean, that put him in the 13th percentile.
What are you talking about, Johnson?
Johnson, when he ran the other day, he ran a 433 short shuttle, which is a really slow time for an outside corner. And that gave me.
So he didn't run a 40, but he ran a short shuttle.
He ran a short shuttle, and that to me, that's slower than a 268-pound Texas Tech tight end that's in this draft, Jalen Conyers, for example. That's slower than Thomas Fedone, the tight end of Nebraska, who's in this draft. That to me gives me that sort of short area very quick change of direction that you need in that nickel spot. That would slightly concern me. And I'm always really wary, as I know you are as well. Historically, my friends and I have called this like the smoke machine part of the year. You just got to kind of find your way through the smoke that's happening.
It's lying season. Yeah.
Lying season. People report this, people report that. People say people are moving up and down, and I don't think that's that to me is a media.
The only thing you hear from me is if it's people that I trust. People,
yeah, absolutely.
What I love about where I am in my life and my career is when people see me say things that they don't disagree, they will call me, and they will lead me in the right direction, and I'm very thankful for that, and I'm very appreciative of that. Or tell me, like, Barron. I had a call about Barron this week, and basically telling me he's going to be a top 10 pick.
Yeah.
And I can understand it because I believe I was talking to you probably a month ago when I started looking at film, and I was watching Texas for some reason, and Barron just stood out. He just absolutely just stood out. I was like, yo, I remember having the conversation with you, and I was like, I would take Barron before I would take Starks.
Yeah.
Not even a doubt in my mind. But speaking of Starks, you surprisingly have him highly rated on your board. I'm not going to tell people exactly where he is, but he's just out of single digits. Why do you have him rated as high as you do, and where do you think he'll be selected?
Where he'll be selected, I think he's probably a top 20 pick. I think. I just think the film, especially you go back to 2023, you look at the film. I thought he was asked to do so much on the back end last year, and he almost became a kind of a victim of the fact that he's so versatile. I mean, I probably watched 4, maybe 5 games snap by snap specific isolation, and then probably watched 10 Georgia games on TV. Just watching games. I like to watch the games as a fan, and then go back and I'll make notes as well while I'm watching them live. But I think he played 699 snaps in the slot, in man or off, at the line of scrimmage as a blitzer, in the box or as a robber. He played from all sorts of different scheme alignments, and he would literally kind of from snap to snap be like, Malachi, we need you in the box. Malachi, we need you as a Malachi, we need you to play outside corner on third down. Malachi, we need to play nickel.
That's the role of when you're the star player.
Absolutely, he's holding that entire secondary together in terms of. So I don't think he had a brilliant year last year, but I think he. And also, I tell you what else he did. Was he absolutely knocked the interview process at the combine out of the park. I spoke to a number of either scouts, or I spoke to one AFC director of college scouting, one NFC director of college scouting, who said that unbelievable. And there were some notes in the draft book where these guys, Kirby Smart, these coaches will absolutely stand on the table for everything that Stark stands for, that he does. He's incredibly intelligent. He's a kind of an alpha, extremely likable kid, great leader. And I know you're not a massive fan, but I do think that he's a really safe, high floor player that comes in, starts straight away, plays really well.
That's fine and great. I'm just not investing a top 20 pick in him. You know who my expectations were? Antrell Roll.
Yeah.
It's just, that's a guy that you can have and use in multiple roles. Went back in his heyday. And I've covered him at the University of Miami. You can put him on the boundary. You can put him in nickel. You can put him in safety. You can make him a blitzer. If that's what you're called on to do, I would expect you to have more impactful plays. And I saw a lot of times when I watched Malachi Starks, he was victimized. It wasn't like impactful play. It was, I'm not scared to go after this guy.
Yeah. I also saw him make I saw him make Sunday plays though as well, and I think that's really important to remember as well. Where he's identifying certain situations, certain scenarios. I can't remember what the game is, but he makes a play where he's cheating down as a robber, and he sees what's happening on the outside. Okay. And he peels off and goes back down the field and either makes a pick on the sideline or knocks the ball away. I can't remember which. It's those Sunday plays for me that stand out, and I do get concerned with. And I say this I say this on my own podcast sometimes, is that fans often worry that, regular fans often worry about the stuff when it comes to draft picks, what somebody can't do. Oh, he can't do this, he can't do that. And I think we get so caught up in what a player can't do, and we forget to focus on all the great stuff that they can do and how they can help, because whether it's a societal thing.
I didn't say you can't help.
I'm not talking about you specifically. I just think that, I think
I remember I began the review process. Okay, this guy is who everybody's saying the Dolphins are going to select, which is a lazy prognostication, which is what people do in the early draft process before free agency starts. Okay, he's the first safety. Let's put him in a team that needs a safety.
Yeah.
And it just did not measure up and did not add up. Same thing with Tyler Warren. And even though I liked what I saw from Tyler Warren, is he playing against the fastest linebackers in his conference? Absolutely not. Is he blocking anybody of substance at the line of scrimmage? Absolutely not. And that's just my personal taste. Everybody's comparing him to the kid in Raiders, and I just don't see that. Do I see a good NFL player? Yes, I do.
Jeremy Shockey to me. That's what he reminds me of.
Ooh, that's high praise,
Yeah,
but I can understand it. I can understand it. I like Arroyo.
yeah.
Now, do I have concerns about his medical? Absolutely. I wouldn't select him probably before the third round. But do I think he's going to be a good tight end in the NFL in time? Absolutely, no question about it. I've seen him up close and personal. He looks like a boy among a man among boys. But so, and also the tight end depth is a very. I mean, where would you say this draft is deeper? Tight end, defensive tackle. I think that, or I don't think there's any really other.
I think defensive tackle is much deeper than tight end. Much deeper than tight end. I mean,
tight end, you might have like 10 starters in this draft, though.
Yeah, I think you're good. I mean, I think if you look at defensive tackle in terms of, you go, look, do I want a big kind of space eating nose tackle? Do I want a guy? And don't forget, these are not always guys that are going to be, every single snap. You're not asking them to play 65, 70 snaps. But I think in terms of, you look at, let's go from the top on down. You go Mason Graham, Walter Nolan, Alfred Collins, Kenneth Grant, Omar Norman Lott, Tyreek Williams, Derek Harmon, TJ Sanders, Jamari Caldwell, CJ West, Vernon Broughton, Joshua Farmer, Darius Alexander. I mean, already what's that, 12, 15? And you got Ty Robinson of Nebraska, Jordan Phillips of Maryland. Shamar Turner obviously came to the Dolphins for a visit. Aeneas Peebles of Virginia Tech, Keontae Hamilton. And then you go and look at, those bigger defensive ends, the kind of the early down defensive ends. You've got your Shamar Stewarts and you've got your Tyrion Ingram Dawkins and your Jared Ivies and your Jordan Birches, who are all in the 280s, 290s, and potentially you could ask one of those to bulk up. And so I think that's just a deeper position for me. And maybe it's less impactful, but I think, there are certain guys that will just be two down guys, but certainly work really well into a rotation of a team who's looking for whether that's a run plugger or a three technique that can come in on obvious passing downs and rush the passer.
Let me ask you about defensive tackle since we're on it. I am not as high on Mason Graham as everybody else in the world. I understand the appeal. I just think he eats a lot off Kenneth Grant, and there's no shame in that because Zach Sealer and Christian Wilkins ate a lot off each other. Explain to me why he's a top 10 pick, because I don't necessarily think he's a top 10 pick.
Yeah, I mean, I just think I find the twitch fascinating, that twitchy movement, and I think it goes back to not last year, even the year before when they won the national championship, when he was a sophomore. And I think you look at what he was able to do, and especially in that playoff. I mean, he took over drives, he dominated drives in that playoff, and I think as a destroyer of blocks, as a guy that always has a pass rush plan in terms of what he can do. I think sometimes he plays a little bit out of control, but what I love about him, and I think this is when you really draw down into the minutiae of a player, what he does is that he sets people up. He sets the center up. He sets a guard up in terms of that plan. He understands that he's going to do something on first down on drive 3 that might not work on first down on drive 3, but is absolutely going to work on second down on drive 5 because he's just set somebody up a certain way in terms of how he uses his arm or how he pushes off or all of those things. And everything is about something else with Graham, which I think is really interesting. I think he's a kind of backfield penetrator who gets downhill extremely quickly on early downs. And I think, on down 3, he's just an explosive pass rusher. And I think that, he's got lateral quickness to make plays outside towards the perimeter. And he's a former wrestler. So he understands leverage. He understands torque. He understands how to move people off a spot, which he does regularly. I obviously have concerns about the fact that he was listed at 318 pounds and, at Michigan. And when he came to the combine weigh in, he was 296, which is obviously 22 pounds lighter. And those short arms are short arms. But as I wrote in the draft book and as a scout said to me, he's a player that's built for autumn, not for fall, in terms of, he's built for games and not for running around in his shorts. And I think what he's done consistently over 2 seasons at Michigan at the highest level, winning a national championship and being dominant in massive games against really good players. And he reminds me a little bit of Wilkins. There is a lot of Christian Wilkins there. In terms of
I do agree with that. Now, I don't necessarily think that Christian Wilkins is not a guy that I'm going to look at from the measurables, the metrics, and the on-field production and say, oh, let me get that. It's not going to excite me. And I'm definitely looking for something a little bit more exciting from the defensive tackle standpoint. I need somebody who will take that center 2 yards into the backfield.
Yeah. Well, the other thing though is that, and I think the Super Bowl was really instructive. The Super Bowl was so instructive about as a wider picture of what the modern NFL is about. And the modern NFL and defensive football is about, can you get home with 4? And that's what the Eagles did. They destroyed the Chiefs. Could they get home with 4? Very famously, Vic Fangio didn't blitz a single time, did not blitz once, but they were able to hurry and harry and harass and irritate and hit and pressure Patrick Mahomes.
And when he set the sack record here with the Dolphins, he rarely ever blitzed.
Yeah, exactly. And that to me is fascinating. And I think that's why those kind of twitchy guys that can dominate, especially on money downs, who can affect the passer, who can collapse a pocket from the inside out, are so vital to the modern game. And I think that's why, we've kind of moved away. So, when I was growing up and even in the sort of my 20s and 30s, when you look back to the kind of the Gilbert Browns and the Albert Hainsworths and those kind of absolute, and even when I was a kid, going right back to the kind of William Perrys, those kind of really big or proportionally big back then, those kind of big guys who are space eaters, downs 1 and 2 players. I think the game has changed so dramatically from that. And yes, you certainly need your Vita Veas, but Vita Vea is kind of this unique player because he can also he's got some pass rush juice inside. And I think that, that's the thing with a Kenneth Grant, or an Alfred Collins, as much as I love Collins, how much interior pass rush juice on third down can you provide for me? And I think that's why you look at some of these guys in this draft, like a TJ Sanders, like a CJ West, especially like an Omar Norman Lott of Tennessee, guys that can just, help your ability to get home with 4. And I think that is so vital. And that obviously is what Mason Graham can provide. It's just that ability to pressure quarterbacks and get off the field on third down. And that's what defensive coordinators are looking for.
Let me ask you this, Simon. Mason Graham is not there because nobody expects him to be there. And I think if he's there at 13, it's you do it. You pull the trigger, depending on what's left on the board. Mason Graham is not there. And you want to address the defensive tackle position, where are you going? What route are you taking?
Again, it goes back to what we just said. And I don't know what Chris Greer values in terms of, does he want somebody that's stylistically similar to Christian Wilkins? Because go back and look at the Sealer and Wilkins combo, the partnership, which was so good. Both of them essentially
they love
they are twitchy, 3 techniques, essentially. They're not, neither of them would ever say they were a nose tackle. Neither of them would ever say they were dominant run players. So, do you think that you want a dominant run player like an Alfred Collins? Well, that's not really been what they've had so much success with. So I look at Walter Nolan, who is at 296 pounds, who is, if it's all there mentally in terms of, how focused is he? He can be an absolute interior destroyer, the like of which we've just talked about in terms of.
You're not worried that he didn't do any combine? He didn't do any?
No, I'm not really worried. I think what we're going to see over the next decade is just players continuing to move away. There's a reason Will Johnson didn't run. There's a reason Tyler Warren didn't run, because of the narrative that, Johnson would probably run in the 4.5s. I think Warren would run in the mid 4.6s, high 4.6s even. And we understand now in the world that we're in with social media, that just becomes this kind of snowball and everyone wants to talk about it. And 24 hours, it just becomes part of this kind of news cycle. Oh, he runs a 4.7, he runs this, he runs that. And he's going to drop. And I just think, and I understand why players just want to avoid that. And, I think Travis Hunter is the best player in the draft by an absolute country mile. But there's a reason why he didn't necessarily run a 40, because, if the best player in the draft isn't going to run a 4.25 or a 4.29, and maybe he runs a 4.45, whoa, really? He's running a 4.45, not a 4.2. I think that just becomes part of this kind of weird narrative.
So now now as the NFL in this era of NIL, you're just going to let players dictate to you without consequences that, hey,
what are they ultimately though? What are they, I mean, what's that famous line by what's the famous line by the by Jason Licht? If Hannibal Lecter ran a 4.2, we'd probably say it was an eating disorder. That's the, it's true. That's the kind of that's the thing. It's at what point do there's a guy in this draft, and we might get to him right now, Isaiah Bond, the wide receiver of Texas. There are some really scarily significant off-field issues.
Really?
I
need to make sure I get to that portion of your draft.
To the point where he might fall out the draft completely.
No,
I mean, we are talking very, very serious stuff. I think a lot of people will be on day 2 will be like, well, what about Isaiah Bond? And I think if he falls, I think that will be the reason why. I think teams have got to marry up. And you look at Walter Nolan and you think, there's a guy who, I mean, he was called a mercenary by a scout. I don't know if you read Bob McGinn's stuff, but, Bob has famously for years talked to scouts, and they kind of go around and I always feel very uncomfortable where what seems like proportionately white scouts talk about bad stuff that they think predominantly black players do or don't. And they talked about Nolan as a kind of a mercenary, and that he followed the money from Texas A&M, or he went to Texas A&M for the money because they were offering more than Tennessee. Yeah. He went to Ole Miss for the money because, I mean, why wouldn't he? I mean, the scout would do exactly the same if he was in the position. But there was a really interesting quote about Nolan. I have to put my glass on to read it, but I've probably got it in front of me here. And it says that, where is it? It says, he is a mercenary. He's probably the biggest mercenary in this whole draft. He's followed the money everywhere, but he's very quiet, very shy. You would think he's totally disinterested. You wouldn't think he's hearing a word the coach is saying to him. But when the ball is snapped for 4 seconds at a time, he is so talented, so gifted. He is so explosive, good with his hands, gives unbelievable effort. But between drills, between snaps, he's on his own program. And I think I can deal with a player like that. I can't deal with a player.
We got too many of them, though.
Well, this is welcome to the NIL era.
You just described Jaylen Ramsey. You just described
Harry Gill. How do you channel these guys? How do you control these guys? How do you? And we're in an era as well with these kids. I mean, my 2 kids are in here, and the attention span is like, boo, it's gone. It's like goldfish, boo, it's gone again. It's like, oh, what are we doing? Boo, it's gone again. And it's just, these kids are exactly the same, except my kids don't have the NIL millions that these guys do, that they've worked insanely hard for. But if you're asking somebody, that's why coaches will talk about team meetings have changed completely. You look
they have 15 minutes. Mike McDaniel, he's like, I got to present to them in 15-minute increments because that's as much of attention span as they have. Yeah. And this is just part of the new NFL. And you know what's funny, Simon? Because I always pay attention to the things that Greer intentionally says without being asked. And he said something about, we have to make sure, everybody said we got to get guys who are game ready, NFL players right out the gate, which, no duh. But he also talked about we need mentally tougher players.
Yeah.
And that to me, it started with Adam Gase telling me about that. And then, Brian Flores, being abusive to see if people could handle the abuse. And, and then, Mike McDaniel, you give them power and influence, and then they just run amok and do whatever they want. And it's very hard and I deal with it in the locker room. It's very hard to deal with this generation of players, and it requires a special amount of maturity. And you heard Chris Greer specifically say that we have to have a special mature player for this era of what's going on. Because think about it from this standpoint. If you're at college, a coach coaches you hard. Oh, I don't like him. I want to go someplace else. You enter the transfer portal, somebody offers you hundreds, if not millions of dollars, and you're gone. You pick up and go. In the NFL, on a rookie deal, you are my prisoner for 4 years. I pay you what I want to. I treat you how I want to. In the old days, what do you think it's going to happen now where a player is not and look at the Cam Smiths of the world, where it's just gobbled him up and spit him out. You have to be mentally tougher. And now they've got the sports psychologists, and every player is supposed to talk to the sports psychologist. And then they've got the criticism from the outside influences. They've got families pulling at them with wanting money, wanting access. They got women coming at them, whether they're married or not. I'm like, how do you handle all of that? And how do you find the right player, which is what Greer was saying, to handle that? Because I'm a firm believer, and I have been talking to people covering that work for this team, say you cannot put everybody in this environment, and it's true.
Of course. I mean, look, I mean, I think the benefit of the NIL era, and I think there are an awful lot of things wrong with it, but I think the benefit is that you're probably getting players, at least these days, who are coming into the league understanding what it feels like to have money. They're not all of a sudden being rich, that they've had a year or 2 years of being very wealthy. And I know that puts them at a very weird goldfish bowl when they're in a college, university community. but obviously not when they get to the NFL. And I think that's quite a weird thing where all of a sudden you're given a $5 million signing bonus and you're like, wow, I've had nothing. You know, I've literally had scraps of a scholarship and I grew up in the worst part of St. Louis or the worst part of Detroit. And
I couldn't even tell you. The person who's lived in poverty the greatest that I've ever seen in my life was Frank Gore. And this was during college years at the University of Miami.
And look at Josh Jacobs.
Anybody live in that level of poverty?
Yeah, Josh Jacobs spent 3 years living in a car. I mean, he literally lived in a car, you know, and now he's one of the best running backs in the NFL. But and there are guys like this in the draft this year. I mean, there's 4 or 5 in the draft book who grew up homeless or grew up in. Luther Burden is a perfect example. I mean, you know, people have talked about Burden and the off the field stuff, and apparently the mum's a problem, and his girlfriend's the agent, and there's all sorts of kind of family members, and it goes back. I mean, you know, one of my favorite books is the Willie Morris book, The Courting of Marcus Dupree, which is the great Marcus Dupree, the great running back from the 80s, who was like the greatest prep running back of all time, went to Oklahoma, was unbelievable as a freshman, and then blew up his knee. And obviously if he'd done the knee in 2025, he'd been fine, but he did it in 1984, and he just was never the same player again. But and there's in the ESPN 30 for 30 documentary they made about Dupree, there's a very famous scene where one of the coaches talks about there's always an Uncle Curly. There was always somebody who just wanted the extra, you know, because boosters were paying money for people in paper envelopes back in the 80s and 90s, and now it's just legal these days. So I'm glad that I'm glad that players are being paid, you know, their due. I think there's a lawlessness about NIL which I find uncomfortable, and I think that, you know, I don't think we've heard the whole truth about the Nico Iamaleava situation in terms of what's been going on at Tennessee, but I'd like players to be paid, and I think they should be paid, but I just think that there needs to be a better policing of it, and I think Nick Saban's right in what he talks about. But I like the fact that players are coming to the NFL and they're not just being thrown money and women and clubs and cars and all of this stuff that we all know goes on, and all the other extracurricular stuff that
the drugs
and all of that. Yeah, all of this sort of stuff. And so finding, you know, and I know, and we speak to scouts and to people, and, you know, the security bill that teams run up each year when they investigate these draft prospects is massive. That's why teams hire former members of the FBI. It's why they hire former members of the Secret Service to go and investigate players and spend 365 days and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars looking into all of these people's lives. They've got people specifically looking at, you know, social media stories going back as far as it does, speaking to every single family member, friends, high school teammates, all of this stuff to find out what are we getting with this guy? What are we getting with a 21-year-old when we put them in this environment? Are they going to sing?
For anybody to do an FBI investigation on me?
Yeah, they'd have to go back a long way to do it on me, I tell you. But I am old. But yeah, I mean, and there's a reason why teams do it, because, you know, you look at Jermaine Burton, the Bengals receiver who they took a chance on last year in the second round, and it blew up in their faces. And, you know, there was some significant off-field issues last year with Burton before the draft, and the Bengals thought they could deal with it, and then he gets arrested in December for allegedly attacking his wife with a knife in their house. And yeah, I think there's a reason why you want to steer towards the Jahdae Barrons and the Malachi Starks of this world, because the Will Campbells and the Ashton Genties, because these kids might let you down physically. Not everybody's going to be an all-pro. Not everybody's going to be a Hall of Famer. But what they won't do is they won't let you down mentally, and they won't let you down as character-wise, and they won't embarrass your organization. And the Dolphins, unfortunately, are in a situation, and have continued to be in a situation, where they've parlayed, you know, a future Hall of Fame receiver on their team versus some of the terrible stuff that happens off the field, and historically has happened off the field. And we need to not sweep Tyreek's history under the carpet. Before he came to Miami, when he was in college, there's a reason why he fell to the fourth round. You look at Joe Mixon and what happened with him when he was at Oklahoma and punching that girl in the bar, and all of those things. There's a reason why teams do what they do and want to try and get the right character guys in the door.
Yeah. Let's get to these defensive tackles, because I know you're a particular fan of the Ohio State. What is his name? No, is it Ohio State? Is it Tariq Williams?
Oh, Tyleik Williams. Yeah.
Where would you go round 2 in this draft? Who would you target if let's say you took an offensive lineman in round 1?
I think Williams will be off the board, unfortunately, when the Dolphins pick. I just do. Unfortunately, and I thought it was interesting yesterday. Tom Pelissaro of NFL Network said that he was hearing a number of names, and I've been saying this for 4 or 5 months. I think we'll see a lot of names in the last 10 picks of the draft that we're not expecting, because I just think teams, and it goes back to the point that you and I had, the discussion that you and I have had about the number of pure first round picks that teams feel like they have. And I think what you'll get is in the 20s, the 25, 26, 27 teams just think, you know what, we might have, or other teams might have a mid-second round grade on this guy, but we really like what player X can do, player Y can do. I think Tyreek Williams is probably one of those guys. He talked to, and Pelissaro talked about Williams specifically. He talked about Carson Swessinger specifically, the linebacker from UCLA, who might be a surprise in the first round. And I like Williams is a good player. I mean, he's nearly 6'3", he's 334 pounds. He's a very good A-gap defender. There are some off-field questions about Williams, but I think it's more maturity than anything else. And he could be, he's a very, there's some bad weight there, I think. I mean, I just think with an improved sort of work ethic and a maturity that is beginning to happen. He shed some pounds a little bit the last year at Ohio State, and he just became an incredibly solid 2-down run stuffer who's got unbelievable power in his hands, and he can shock, he can stack and shed, he can make tackles behind the line of scrimmage. And if you decide that, you know what, Zach Sieler's just going to be our juice guy, and we're going to have a guy next to him who's just going to be a soaker. And then on third down, we're going to pick somebody up in the 4th or 5th round that we know is a 3 technique, can just rush the hell out of things, and we can rotate him in with Zach and take our big run stuffer off. Then if that's what they're after, then, you can't go wrong with a guy like Williams, much as you can't go wrong with a guy like Alfred Collins in terms of just the guy that will just hold players up, hold guards up, stack, shed, boom, make a tackle, and it's 2nd and 9, because that's ultimately what you want. What you don't want is somebody running all over your face on first down and putting you in a 2nd and 1 because you just can't stop the run.
So let me ask you about the offensive line.
Yeah.
Day 2, let's assume that they don't have, I want to get you Simmons, Banks.
Yeah.
I know Booker, a lot of people don't feel like he's a good fit. I completely disagree. I know he doesn't fit the scheme, but I'm sorry. They're rarely humans who move people like that.
Yeah, he's a good player. He is a good player. And I think it goes back to what we talked about 20 minutes ago in that, the narrative, certainly for Miami, has become the stuff that he can't do, within the confines of the scheme specifically. But I think, what we shouldn't forget is that he is a very good player. What I think is the concern for Miami, beyond the fact that he is, 321 pounds and doesn't move on the field like a player that fits this scheme, because he's not. He's a gap power guy. I think what's very instructive when you go and look at the numbers from the combine, and yes, it's it's underwear athletics. We all know this, but his relative athletic score was just 4.03.
Yeah.
He ran a 5.39.40, which I don't really care about because I don't really care what 40 time an offensive lineman runs. But his 10-yard split, which I think is quite important, was 1.97, which is as slow as I can remember. And that is a really slow 10-yard split. And when you're looking for a guy that can run 10 yards as a zone guy, for people that are cursory fans and don't really understand what we talk about in terms of zone blocking, what you're looking for is guys that are athletic that can move, but they can't just move. What they need to do is they need to be able to move from their spot. Let's say you're playing left guard. You need to be able to move from your spot on the snap to get to the guy that's shaded inside you, facing you as a defensive tackle. And you need to be able to get up and out to their outside shoulder. So if you are facing, if I'm facing the way that I'm looking, I need to get my right hand out onto the outside shoulder of the guy that's already 3 yards ahead of me because of where he's positioned. That is not Tyler Booker's game. And if you're running
not only his short, his bad 10 split, but 21 reps of 225. Yeah. And I understand. And then I understand that's not. I'm a big 225 guy. I'm a big rep guy from this standpoint. It just allows you to measure apples with apples. I would feel way more comfortable with Tyler Warren if I had a 22 on a bench press, and I can say, okay, I'm certain that he can do the inline work that I need to get done. Without that, I'm just like, give you a perfect example of this. Chop Robinson. You never got a rep. You never got a bench. You know why you never got a bench? Because it wouldn't have been good. You know why he can't set the edge? Because he doesn't have the functional strength to set the edge.
And it was obvious from his tape. And then, that there's a reason why he didn't need to kind of underline that with the fact that, I'm going to go and do 18 on the bench or whatever it is.
18. Oh.
Oh, no, well, whatever the number would have been, I don't think.
Yeah. And that's the thing, because a lot of this process is bringing out their warts.
Yeah, of course, that's what it's there to do. Unless you have a Shamar Stewart type performance or a Mike Mamula, you go back and look at the classic kind of combine performance that everybody talks about. Yeah, it is absolutely bringing out the kind of you go back and remember the guy from the Eagles draft in the first round, Mike Mamula out of Boston College about 20 years ago, and he had the unbelievable combine performance, ended up going in the top 10 and then just flamed out, but because he just wasn't the player on tape that he was in his underwear running around Indianapolis. And I think that's obviously some of the things that you've got to be careful about. And we talked about narratives earlier on in terms of, bad narratives can run away, but also kind of good narratives can run away. If the combine for me is that, and I'm sure it is for you as well, it should be instructive to what you see on the tape. If what you see on the tape is generally backed up by what you see at the combine, that feels like it's okay. If somebody's performance is absolutely extraordinary, but the tape is like really average, that makes you go back and look at the tape and go, what am I missing? Or vice versa. If somebody has a bad combine performance, but you look at the tape and think, I really love this guy. I really love what he could do in a certain scheme here, and here. Mm-hmm. You go back and look at it and say, look, what am I missing out on? What isn't quite working here? So I think the combine is part of the instructive conversation, but it shouldn't be the be all and end all that I think some people make it.
Where are you with Simmons and Banks?
I like them both. I think
at 13.
Look, pretty much every mock I see done by national media members seems to have the Dolphins taking a left tackle. I didn't like Patrick Paul at Houston. I thought his tape was really, really average, and I was shocked but not surprised that we took him. I don't think his performance was particularly good last year when he was forced into action. For a 4-year starter as well, I found his tape deeply uncomfortable at Houston. But the question is, what are they going to do? They spent a second-round draft pick on it.
No. I watched enough of him because Tehran doesn't practice, so I've watched enough of him to know that he'll be okay. Can I tell you he'll be a top 10, top 16 left tackle? No, but he moves people. He's got a high motor, so he's not gonna play like he's out of gas at snap number 50.
Yeah.
And he can move in the zone.
The question for me has always been the hands. The hands are so wide. He never attacks the breastplate here. He's always outside wide on the shoulders, and he gives up his own chest, which is a thing that really concerns me. He did it at Houston the whole time. He comes in, he clamps on the outside, and then this whole part of his body is just wide open. So, you play against a Myles Garrett, and every single time Garrett's just absolutely driving up through his chest, and he's got hold of this, and he's winning the leverage battle and walking him back, and it doesn't matter.
That is my concern. Can he anchor down against some of the elite pass rushers?
So the question about Simmons and Banks is that, to me, Simmons is a pure left tackle. He's not a guard. I don't know why you draft him at tackle if you're going to make him a guard. Draft him at 13 if you're going to make him a guard. He is not a guard. He is a left tackle. Banks has never taken a snap at Texas or in high school at left guard. Is that to say he can't do it? Absolutely not. He can do it. And what I like about Banks is he is a very deliberate leverage player in the run game, especially at the second level. If you go back and watch him in isolation tapes at Texas, when he gets out to the second level, you will literally watch him almost more than anybody I can think of in the draft. Literally, it's absolutely textbook. He sinks his knee, he sinks his hips, and he drives up through the pads and he attacks this part of the chest and he moves people off the ball at the second level. And when you're looking for a guy who can move the way that he does, and he moves very well, you could see, and I think the Dolphins' offensive line is worse now than it was at the end of last season in terms of, you've lost Tehran. It's just
you lost Tehran. You lost who's the backup left tackle again?
The guy I really like, whose name completely escapes me, but he went to the Eagles.
Yeah. Same here.
Yeah. Kendall Lamb.
Yeah, Kendall Lamb. Yeah.
You
lose.
And
even Rob Jones. I know people. Rob Jones would probably be my ideal number 6, and he's not even here anymore. He's now Dallas's number 6. Yeah, that's fine and good. They got to rebuild the whole line. Let me ask you this question: with Tua and his height, do you worry about an offensive lineman and their height?
A little bit, but then I do wonder. Yeah, I do wonder about. I do wonder about lane integrity, which I think is really important. I also know that we're not playing. This is not Joe Montana's 1987 49ers or whatever. Everything is out the gun now. I mean, how often are we under center? It's very rare, and if we are under center, it's often for that sort of trickeration that we do so well. So there's usually a good sort of 4 or 5 yards of the ability to see over. The fact that Patrick Paul is 6'10", 8, 7. I mean, he's a massive human being anyway. So I don't have Tua didn't have a problem with it in college, and he was playing with, Leatherwood was 6'6" or whatever. He had some big old dudes playing on the offensive line at Alabama, and it was never an issue. He doesn't get a lot of batted passes. I think Ryan Tannehill was 6'6", and Tannehill has a lot of batted passes. So I just think, a lot of it is about eye work, in terms of Tua's eye manipulation is really good. I've never felt like the lanes are clogged up because he can't see over the line of scrimmage. So, and also I just don't think guards pop straight up. They just don't stand up to their full. If you're playing guard well, your knees are bent, your hips are dropped, and you're probably 3 or 4 inches lower than you should be anyway, because nobody's standing up straight tall. Because if you are, you literally end up leaning at the waist. You're off your skis. People can move you off a point. So I don't really have an issue with that.
Okay. Give me we'll close with this, Simon, and tell people where they can get the draft guide as well, because I think that's important.
It's 2025 2025 draft book, all one word, 2025 draft book at gmail.com. And if you live in the UK, it's £10. And if you live in the United States, because of the tariffs, it's $13 whole, which is essentially the price of about 2.5 cups of coffee at Starbucks or whatever. So
yeah,
and it's 135 pages. There's 455
reading. I'm looking at it now. I didn't even address you. I should hit you with some of these rapid fire here. You got Colston Loveland, rather high.
Yeah, I mean, he's the number 1 tight end to me. He's just the epitome of what a modern day NFL tight end is, in terms of what you want to do. And he's a much better blocker than people have ever given him credit for. And he played really well as a blocker last year, even though he had a shoulder injury, which he literally hurt in the first game of the season. I think just what you can do with him and how he plays. He is an absolute alpha. He holds his own teammates accountable on a very, very, very high level. He is a really, really good modern day NFL player who can block as a Y, but can just do what Brock Bowers essentially did. Yeah, he will run up the seam. He is fast. He is quick. He is big. He attacks dead areas of zones. He can win in man. I mean, he's the epitome of the modern day 2025 NFL tight end.
Now you've got. I will give you the FSU cornerback Azariah Thomas.
Yeah, Azariah Thomas. Yeah.
You got him high. Why?
Because I saw him physically up close in Ireland pre-season. I was on the field pre-game. He's big, he's thick, he's well put together, he's long. And I just love his tape. His tape is outstanding. I think he's the best pure man match corner in the NFL, in the draft in terms of press cornerbacks. I don't think there's anybody better than him. He is physical. He runs the routes for receivers. The thing that concerns me, obviously, and I praise him for doing it, but he ran a 4.58, which is a slow time, and that wasn't at the combine. That was at the Seminoles Pro Day, and you add in the Pro Day tax, which obviously takes numbers down.
Mm-hmm.
That is a slow time. But I then go back and look at the tape, and I think, you know what? Over multiple seasons, he gave up 4 explosive plays in 3 seasons. You just don't see him get beaten over the top. And I know we talk about long speed, but we do not live in an era, even though we live in a passing era, where people are just throwing 60-yard bombs on every play. Azariah Thomas is not being asked to turn around and run 100 yards down the field and then come back to the line of scrimmage and do exactly the same. That's just not how the game works. So I think what you're betting on is the physicality. You're betting on the fact that he understands routes really, really well. He's got great feet. He's got great hips. He's really physical early on in the route. He can move his receiver off a point. He's tough. He's tough at the catch point. He's tall. He's long. He's got long arms, and he's a good tackler. I just really like his tape, and it made me go back after the FSU Pro Day and rewatch it. I didn't come away loving him any less. So I think he's a good player.
Gray Zabel, you got in your top 25. I think he could be the pick at 13. The position versatility is tremendous. The performance at the Senior Bowl is magnificent. Would you be surprised if he's the 13th pick?
I wouldn't. I think some Miami fans would blow their stack if that happened. I just think, look, you've got to go back and look at the tape. Both at smaller school guys. He's from North Dakota State. You're obviously kind of beating up on civilians a little bit, and that's why the All-Star games are so important. But he went to the Senior Bowl and was absolutely dominant. And I think there is. I spoke to some teams who think he can be a left tackle. I spoke to some teams that think he can be a left guard. I spoke to one team, and I know that multiple people at the Senior Bowl thought that his best position actually was center. I know Jim Nagy thought he could be a center. And I think that's the beauty of a prospect like him, that he is so versatile. So, for example, if Aaron Brewer gets hurt, then you can potentially put Zabel at center. If Patrick Paul gets hurt, you can potentially put Gray Zabel at left tackle, and he's never going to let you down. I just think for an outside zone team or even an inside zone team like the Dolphins, he's so quick, he's so fast up to that outside shoulder that we talked about.
Love him.
And then he brings his body through contact. He rolls his hips through contact, which is so important when you're doing that. And you just go back and look at his tape, and it's absolute teach tape, and not just at the North Dakota State level, but at the Senior Bowl, he was just dominant doing what he'd done at North Dakota State.
Now, give me 5 prospects that you want on your team.
Sorry, say that again. I missed that first part.
5 prospects that you would want on your team if you were drafting. Don't have to be first round. In fact, I prefer you avoid first rounders.
Oh, avoiding first rounders. Wow. Crikey. Alfred Collins of Texas, the defensive tackle. This is hard. Alfred Collins would be one. Who else? The kid from Ohio State, Travion Henderson, would be a second.
The running back, okay.
Yeah. Emeka Ibuka of Ohio State, the receiver.
Brian Hartline product.
Jack Kaiser, the Notre Dame linebacker. You look at what the Notre Dame linebackers did last year in terms of the NFL, in Maris Leofau and Junior Colson. Both of them were excellent last year, mid-round picks. They're just so NFL ready. And I thought the Senior Bowl, and I spoke again to teams at the Senior Bowl who were just like, this kid's just an absolute day one starter in terms of what he can do. And then there's a safety at Virginia called Jonas Sanka, who I think will be a day 2 pick, who I absolutely love. I just think he's just a really, really good player. He's just a really solid player. And I was watching somebody a couple of weeks ago, a receiver doing work in the return game, and they were playing against Virginia, and the ball gets kicked deep, and it's a really good punt, and the returner has to kind of back up, and then he fumbles it, and he picks it up, and he breaks contain, looks like he's going to break, and all of a sudden from the right hand side of the screen comes Jonas Sanka bursting through and makes an absolutely stunning tackle, forces a fumble, recovers it himself, and I'm just like, oh my god, I wasn't even watching you again, even though I've already done the report on you, I love you, and I hadn't even seen this play, and boom, here he is, knocking somebody on their ass on special teams. I'm just like, yes, sign me up to a bit of Jonas Sanka. I love that kid.
Gotcha. I appreciate it. Well, Simon, we thank you for your time. Thank you for educating people. Listen, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in this draft. It's as Chris Greer has a shirt that says, "Don't F it up." So it'll be interesting to watch what happens. I think they got to trade down because I want more currency. I don't mind taking a second tier guy if I'm going to have more opportunities, more bites at the apple. So
the concern would be who are the takers. That's the concern for me. Who's trading up for who? Do you know what I mean? It's just like there's not that much difference between a player at 13 and a player at 30 in terms of the kind of the value. For every Kenneth Grant, there's a Tyreek Williams. For every you and I have talked about this offline. There are lots of players that can kind of match and be very, very similar. I would be scared about who's falling so much that somebody feels like they have an absolutely unless it's the quarterback, unless Sanders falls a little bit and somebody.
I think he's gonna fall. If New Orleans doesn't take him, I think he's gonna be sitting there waiting for the Steelers. Because I don't think anybody's coming up to get him.
And at that point, somebody like Greer would need to, you need to almost generate a market and be on the phone to the Steelers and saying, look, we're getting a call from, whoever it might be that wants to move back in or whoever,
You think he's a bluffer?
I mean, I think it's unlikely, if we're going to be brutally honest. I think it's unlikely, but we'll see.
It'll be interesting to see what happens when he's there at 13 and Dolphins pass on him, because I know they're not going to take him.
Yeah, they're not.
But it's going to be a fun week, folks.
Really will be.
Here on Dolphins In Depth. Simon, tell them where they can find you on your blog, on your podcast.
It's the 3 Yards Per Carry podcast, which I do with Chris Kaufman and Alfredo Artiaga. So, 3 Yards Per Carry on all your good podcast networks.
All righty, folks. Thank you for watching, and hopefully we will have a good draft in 2025.
Fingers crossed.